Good morning. It is Friday. Finally, Friday. I know we say that every week, but I really mean it. Welcome to the Friday Grief Chat. I am Jill, and that's not Deb because Deb isn't here today. My thoughts go out to her. She is hanging out in a blizzard in Skokie, Illinois this morning, taking care of a friend who's facing some serious health crises. Because, that's what people do when they are both nurses and experienced in all things kind of cataclysmic health. So, Deb, I'm thinking of you. I know all of our viewers are thinking about you. And I hope that things are as good as they can be where you are right now. I am here in Southern California where it is a crisp and chilly morning. It is 52 degrees outside, which for Southern California, that's kind of just above freezing. It means heavy sweaters and more sweaters and all the things because we get cold. If you are listening to this after the fact on our podcast or watching this after the fact on Humor, Grace, and Grief on Facebook, welcome. All of our recordings are available on the podcast link, and all of the recordings that have the video are on the Humor, Grace, and Grief webpage on Facebook. So, welcome, welcome. Whew, all that being said, today, while you got me, just me, all me, we're going to talk about all the things that folks who do grief and folks who do um, anticipatory grief can help someone with while they are facing the imminent death or the loss of a loved one. That comes from having had lots of questions this week from various people. That comes from what Deb is doing right now. Comes from a conversation early this morning on a therapist Facebook page where someone said, I think I want to do grief. How do I find out how to do this stuff? And it comes from being ready to go join Debbie Jenkins Frankel in the next hour to talk on the therapist um, private practice grief page, where we're going to talk about the difference between grief coaches and grief therapists. That's not what this is today. Here on Humor, Grace, and Grief, and the Friday Grief Chat, I would like to talk into and maybe talk at you about what it is that you can find help with if you are facing someone who is end of life, or if you are facing being at the end of life, or if you are grieving, and what grief folks can do for you. And grief folks, I mean all of the people who do all of the stuff at end of life. So that includes end of life doulas or death doulas, who are amazing people. I happen to know a few. Some hospices are actually using them now to train their volunteers who do end of life sitting with families. Excuse me, Buddy is making tons of noise today. Aren't you, Butters? Um, he's got a bone and he won't let go of it. I apologize. It includes people who are considered hospice staff, who do hospice chaplaincy. It includes hospice folks who are there for end of life. It includes therapists who help people who are suddenly in a position of an illness, whether anticipated or not, and looking at end of life, or a loved one being at end of life, all those things. And it includes grief providers, which can include a grief therapist who can be an LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist, an LPCC, licensed professional clinical counselor, or like me, an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker. It can also include PsyDs, or it can include psychologists who have a full PhD. There's a wide variety of people who do this work. What you want to find is someone who's trained and skilled in it. Because I will tell you that nowhere in anybody's education, unless you're doing a thanatology degree, which is about loss, you're not going to find that there's a lot of really specific training about supporting someone in end of life or doing grief work. That comes from folks seeking out their own training and finding out what they want to do with it, and then finding someone to train them in how to do it. And grief work also includes non-death grief. It can include all the losses we've talked about before here on the chat. It can include pet loss. It can include loss of a neighborhood, loss of a friend, loss of a relationship, divorce. We are going to have a good friend of mine, Amaret. She's going to be coming in and talking at the end of the month about divorce loss and what that means and what that looks like and that feels like. There's all kinds of people who can help you if you are looking at loss. So let's go from, in terms of an anticipatory death process. For those folks, you do have your death doulas, and those are people that you can hire independently, and they are trained specifically in how to support someone preparing for a family member or for their own death. There are several universities who have certificates in this. There are a couple of death doulas who've created their own certification programs. It is not highly regulated, kind of like coaching, not highly regulated, but you can ask someone for their credentials and see what kind of training they've had. If someone is a death doula and they've spent years in hospice, my guess is you're going to be in really good hands because that's someone who's not afraid of end of life, not afraid of talking about death and dying. Someone like Jill and Deb, because we can talk about death and dying all day long, and we don't find it to be sad. Most of the time, it's about how to make it a better process and how to make it a less painful process. It's about how not to be afraid of morphine, which is a huge fear for lots of people. How not to be afraid of hospice, right? Here comes Deb. Yep, yeah, we can. We can talk about all of that. We want people to not be afraid to reach out and get that help. There was somebody that I was working with who was working with someone who was really afraid to have hospice come in. And when they finally agreed to allow hospice to do an evaluation this week, hospice came in and just scooped them up. And they are providing all the support they need. They could have hired a death doula or an end of life doula to come in earlier and help them prepare. End of life doulas help with figuring out what goodbyes need to be said, what things you need to do to get your house ready, figuring out if you're going to stay at home, figuring out who's going to help, making sure all the paperwork is in order. They don't do legal advice, but they can help you figure out that you need legal advice and help you ferret out who you might want to look at and give you some referrals because they tend to know who those people are. When you do this, you know who the people are, right? Just like when you're fixing a house and you're a contractor, you know who all the subs are, right? So there are subs in this, if you want to look at it that way. If you are looking at hospice, then you want to call around and find out which hospice is good and which hospice is not. I have a family member right now who has a related by marriage family member who is entering hospice today. And so I gave them a quick checklist, what things to ask about, because they don't know the hospices in that area. Deborah says, and never feel bad about questioning a nurse or hospitalist who gives you information that you aren't comfortable with. Absolutely. Someone says something and you don't understand it, it doesn't make sense, or it doesn't feel right, check it, right? So when you're talking about whether or not you want to hire a hospice, you want to make sure it's one that can do end of life care, that has their own staff who can do what we call continuous care, which means there's something out of control and they're going to have someone in your home with you around the clock until such time as the out of control ends. If they have to sub that out instead of having their own trained staff who are absolutely certainly prepared to deal with end of life, then you need to go on to another hospice. You want to make sure that that hospice has a doctor who's going to be out in the first couple of days of service. And if they say, well, the doctor gets the report from the nurse and he or she never makes a visit to the home, my answer is, then I need to find another hospice because I want that doctor to know who my loved one is. And I want them to see who they are as a person, not just a diagnosis and a series of symptoms and medications. I wanted them to know who Linda was, who Casper was, who my mom was. I want them to be able to say, you know, This is what's going to happen directly to the patient. And I want them to answer their questions. And I want it to come from the tippy top. And then I want a nurse case manager who's going to always be the nurse case manager, because I don't want it to be a revolving door. I want them to have complete security and trust with the nurse providing their care. Now, lots of hospices have a nurse case manager and then they have several other nurses. Great. But that means you've got one nurse who really knows your loved one. And that's what you want. You don't want revolving, right? My late wife, Casper, was one of the backup nurses. She was the LVN on the RN LVN team. She knew as much as the RNs. Sorry, guys, don't get all offended. She did. And that meant that the RN case manager knew that if Casper called and said, this patient needs this, this, and this, that they could trust that. That's the kind of team that you want. You want to make sure they have a chaplain who is not denominational. You don't ever want a chaplain walking in with an anticipation of what religion you are, or that you even want religion. You get to decide what it is that you as the patient and you as the family want or don't want. As an example, my first wife, Linda, who died in 2010, she actually told the chaplain that she didn't want anyone praying with her, but she'd love it if they could read a book together. And that is what the chaplain did. Thank you, Audrey. You were amazing. And Audrey brought a book and they just read. By the time Linda died, they were actually saying some prayers together because that was important to Linda. But she was not terribly trusting because of some earlier religious trauma in her life. That's the kind of chaplain that you want, right? If you want more on that, then you can look up the podcast about hospice. I'll put it in the show notes. And you can, there's a chaplain who's involved in that, and he's amazing. And he trains his chaplains to do things right, right? Deborah says, or a chaplain that puts their religion first in prayer and thought. You don't want that, right? You want to make sure there's a social worker and that social worker is willing to do more than just be sent out one time to do paperwork. Social workers, believe it or not, yeah, we're clinical too. I can do therapy. And in fact, I do therapy all day long. I can also do paperwork all day long. I do both. That's the joy of an MSW. We are trained in micro and macro, which means we can do individual therapy. We can also work with agencies. We can work with benefits. We can work with helping you identify what things are left undone, both emotionally and business-wise, and help ferret all that stuff out. You want that social worker. And you want a hospice that doesn't treat social workers like they're just paper pushers, because then you're not getting the benefit of having a social worker. You want one of us to walk in who can really get nosy if you want us to, and who can also help. I have sat on the floor with grandchildren when there's been a beloved grandfather dying. And I've walked in with my paper and my crayons and my pencils, and we've drawn pictures and written messages, and then gathered around the patient's bed, and they've been able to read their messages to their grandpa. That's what a hospice social worker can do. I have met a classroom full of kids at a mortuary when a beloved teacher had died, and she was an amazing woman. I just adored her. She was very young, and truth be told, she shouldn't have died, but medical insurance got in the way of her getting care. That was many years ago. The school bussed in the entire classroom to the mortuary 2 hours before the visitation. And because of that, we could sit down in the aisle of the mortuary, and we drew the pictures and we wrote the notes. And then the kids who wanted to approach the casket could, and the kids who didn't. Their parents sat in the back, gave the parents a chance to do some grieving and some healing, and to see their little people could actually grieve and needed to grieve and needed to talk about this, which is what we want to train parents to do, right? We want them to help their kids be good grievers, because we need to do this throughout our whole lives. Loss is part of our lives. And then the kids, some stayed for the visitation. Most of them went home with their parents. Lots of them went out for ice cream, which is what I think every child should do after visitation: donuts or ice cream every time. That's a Jill rule. That's a Jillism. And they got to say goodbye to their teacher. Some went to the funeral, some did not. They had their time. That's what a hospice social worker can do. That's what a grief therapist can do. During the dying process, you want hospice. After the loss, the survivors may or may not want grief therapy. Don't anticipate that everyone needs therapy. Some people have been preparing for a death for a long time. Some people have not. If it's a sudden death, you may need someone who's a grief therapist slash coach, which can be either Jill or Deb or any number of other people, or even an end of life doula, to help make quick decisions that are going to meet the needs of the whole family. I've worked with several people recently who've had really sudden death, not as a therapist, just as a friend. And I wouldn't be talking about them otherwise. And they needed to kind of ferret out, what do we do? We didn't think we'd be planning a funeral right now. This is all kinds of wrong. And so we talked about everything from, do you want to have a full funeral? Do you want to have a memorial? Do you want to have a gathering at a house? Do you want to have a caterer? Do you want to have someone bring in Costco or a potluck? What represents your loved one? If there are kids involved, we need to make sure that there's some stuffies for them, some stuffed animals, right? The new ones, the ones that really squish down, squishimals, those are awesome. And they come in a variety of creatures, so everyone can have their own. But little people, when they have to go to one of these things, they need something to hold on to, folks. Get stuffed animals, get something. Make sure you've bought stock in Kleenex, the good Kleenex, not the cheap stuff. You want the stuff that's got the softening in it, because your nose might get a little raw, right? You need to have someone help you make decisions so that the decisions are your own, not ones that you're going to get pushed into. And if there's a family disagreement, it helps sometimes to have a mediator. That's where a grief therapist or a grief coach can also help immediately after a death. Yeah, Deb says the softest, soft Kleenex. You want all the soft, right? Sometimes even picking out flowers can cause a family war. You don't have to have just one set of flowers, folks. You can have lots. When my mom died in June, there you go, extra soft. Part of what I did was budget so that each one of the sisters, myself and my two sisters, could have our own arrangement at the front of the church. And it could be something that represented our relationship with our mom and the things we did with our mom and our kids did with our mom. And each of us knew that one was ours. It didn't mean we were at war. It meant that there were 3 kids. And it felt like representation was important, right? So there's lots of ways that a grief coach, grief therapist, doula can help in the immediacy, in the someone is sick, I don't know what to do. Someone's in the hospital, I don't know what to do. Reach out and get some advice from someone outside that system. Truth be told, lots of hospitals have agreements with just a few hospices, and those are the only hospices they refer to. There have been a couple instances recently where someone was told, well, these are the 2 hospices you can have come to the hospital. They'll evaluate, and then from there you can decide which hospice you want. That was, no, this is pay for play, and only these 2 hospices are going to be allowed to sign you on. That's illegal. In the United States, especially if someone's Medicare age, you can choose whichever hospice you want. Even if you're in an HMO like Kaiser, you don't have to have their hospice. Ask around, find out who's good right now, because hospices change. So make sure you're getting advice from people who know systems, but maybe aren't part of the system, and someone you can trust or someone that you love trusts, so that you're getting the advice you need. You can take a breath. Barbara Carnes, who's a really well-known grief writer, and someone I consider a friend, says in one of her books, the one thing you have to do right after someone is diagnosed or right after someone has died is nothing. you can do absolutely nothing. You can sit in that moment. You can stretch and pull your hands in, breathe. You can let your head settle with what you've just heard. And from there, you can decide the who's, the what's, the how's. Deb says, yeah, nothing is something. Absolutely. You can take your moment, take your breath, and decide. And then you can build your team. And likewise, after a death, you can decide what you need. You don't have to, the day after grandma dies, take your kids to a grief therapist. They're still numb. And they're kids, so they're going to grieve the way kids grieve, which is different from the way you're going to grieve. And if you've got a little, a middle, and a teen, they're all going to grieve differently. And they're all going to grieve differently from you. So don't anticipate that everyone has to have the same grief process, because they won't. When my mom died, there were 3 daughters, passel of grandchildren. There was a great-grandchild. There were friends. There was extended family. There were siblings. There were sibling spouses. There were tons of relationships. And everybody's grief was different. And everybody's grief needed to be honored. And everyone's heart needed to be taken care of as the precious thing that it was. And that's what ought to happen after a loss. Same for pets. Same for moving. Right? Same for right now. Literally, they're doing the inspection on my mom's house next door right now. That's a loss for me. And so I will deal with that my way. My sisters are dealing with it their way, because that's the way grief works. And everyone has their support system, because that's the way it should work. Now, after a loss, you can work with a grief coach if it's somebody that you trust and somebody who's got experience. You can work with an end-of-life doula, because some of them do grief coaching and some of them are grief therapists. You can work with a grief therapist. You can find them on any number of places. You can search for us on Psychology Today and a number of other places. But you want to check the credentials, folks. You want to make sure it's somebody who actually knows what they're doing, not someone who woke up today and said, "Oh, I think I want to do this. I'm going to add it to my list of things." Because when a therapist is signing on to all the online systems we have to put ourselves out, there are boxes we check. Oh, I'm good at this and this and this and this. There are about 62 of them now. And what I tell my team in my office is, I don't want to see more than 3 or 4, because nobody does everything. Nobody. I can work with a child with ADHD. I'm good at it. I'm not going to advertise that's my specialty, because that's really Amarette's specialty, and she really does it. I can help. I can do it if I need to, and I can help your child. But my specialty are these things. So when you see someone who's got 42 specialties, then you need to start asking questions, right? You can go to a cancer hospital, and if you've got a broken leg, they will send you off to the ER at the regular hospital, because that's the way it should be done. So when you are looking at who you want to bring in onto your team to survive and thrive after a loss, you want someone who's got your orientation to this. You want someone who, if you've had a sudden loss, understands sudden loss. If you've had a death by suicide, you should have someone who understands the dynamics that you are facing, because they are very different from someone who just lost a child to cancer. And that's not to say either loss is any worse or any better. And that's not to say there's blame for any of those losses, but you need someone who understands the dynamics. If you're a therapist who's just had a loss, you've lost a client. You've lost a client to suicide. You need someone who knows how to help you with those things, because those are really hard losses, and therapists can't talk about our losses because everything's 100% confidential. And if you're a therapist thinking about specializing, maybe that's your specialty, how to help therapists who are facing those losses. If you're a therapist and you are facing losses in your own family while working, you need someone who knows what that's like because they need to be able to give you, yes, some support and yes, therapy, but also some down to earth practical advice. How do I manage this craziness? And if you are someone who is facing widowhood with small children, or just losing your dad and your mom is elder and may need help now, you need someone who knows those dynamics. Loss is not generic, it's lots of things, and you want to make sure that you're finding someone who knows how to do it, knows the dynamics, knows the support systems, knows the referrals out in case you need them. If you already have a therapist and you're experiencing a loss, ask them how they do grief work. What do they do? I've had some wonderful experiences with grief therapists, and I've had some really awful ones with people who said they did grief and didn't know what they were doing. So you want to make sure that it's someone who knows what they're doing. And while I am a licensed therapist, and so there is a huge bias on my part for licensed therapists, I've also worked in end of life care. And I know there are a lot of people who are not licensed therapists who are really damn good at doing grief work. And if that is the person that you need and they are available, then I'm not going to tell you not to. BBS, don't listen to me. Right? Board of Behavioral Sciences in California. I think what's important when you're grieving is that you have someone who meets you where you are, has your same orientation, who, if you are spiritual, can meet you in a spiritual spot. If you are someone who is not spiritual, who won't impose that on you. Someone who can understand your cultural pieces of your loss. All those things are really, really important. So do your homework. And if you are facing, this is just the beginning of something, I'm not sure what to do, reach out and ask the questions. Don't rely on the regular medical community to give you those referrals. One, they don't have them. Two, they may have contracts that mean that you're going to get sent to somebody just because there's a contract, not because they're quality. And three, they may not answer your questions honestly. Like Deb said, you should feel perfectly open to question what you're being told and perfectly open to questioning what you're not being told. The average time on hospice in this country is 2.5 days. That's not long enough. The benefit starts at 6 months, and you don't have to die in 6 months. You can be continued after 6 months. Hospice gives support and brings in those extra pieces so that your stress can go down, so that you can have the moments in your head to look for extra support outside of that too. So you can find some quality time and find some joy in life while you are anticipating the end of life. All of that is super important. And it also gives you time to get things in order. And that's also important. And speaking as a grieving daughter, it gives you time to write the names on the darn pictures, to tell people what you want them to have, so that nobody has to make those decisions after you are gone. Deb says, many people that work in hospitals don't know hospice or doula end of life answers to questions. They do not. And more than that, people in hospitals are busy, overworked, overwhelmed, and sometimes they're afraid of death and dying too. When you work in a hospital, you're there to help people get better. And you want someone who's there to help end of life be better. And that's a significant difference. I know I've been kind of all over the place today. I hope this has been helpful. I would love to have you check out more on Humor, Grace, and Grief on Facebook, to look at our previous recordings where there's lots of things there. I'd love to have you check out the Heart of Hospice podcast, which is the one that I was referring to earlier. And it has the word "the" in it, not just Heart of Hospice, the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find me at therebelliouswidow.com and jilljohnsonyoung.com, where you'll find a ton of podcast recordings that I've been on. and you can have more questions answered as well. And we are here every single Friday, 10 o'clock Pacific, 11 o'clock Mountain, noon Central, 1 o'clock Eastern time. The rest of you are on your own. You can figure it out. In Arizona, you're definitely on your own. You can't figure out if you're daylight savings time or not. So enough of that. You can figure out when we're on. But we record them all, and they're all on the podcast site as well. I wish everyone a really good week. Deb and I will be back next week together. And in the meantime, you go have a really good week. And remember, even in loss, there's joy in life, and you can find some sun even in a blizzard. Many hugs, everyone. Have a good week.